Hello and welcome to Micro-Credentials 101. I'm Bucky Dodd. I'm going to be providing this short lesson with the purpose of really helping to establish a common foundation and understanding about what micro-credentials are. And then throughout the series, we're going to build on this definition, these understandings around micro-credentials to go and build them, analyze market trends so that we know what types of micro-credentials to build, and ultimately use strategies to help grow and connect them with learners. So when we think about this question of what is a micro-credential, if you search in Google and you type in this question, you probably will have a lot of different definitions that come up. This is a relatively newer term in the history of higher ed, if you will, but really many of the same things that we use to develop micro-credentials and assess micro-credentials have been used in our very standard practices in the field of education. And so while there are newer aspects about this term of what is a micro-credential, it also builds on an extensive background of research and literature and practice that we can draw upon to really help inform the way that we actually go and build and support micro-credentials for learners. So within the state, we actually have a definition that's been outlined in our policies and procedures. And this definition is very helpful to begin to understand ways that we can incorporate micro-credentialing in our institutions and working in partnerships with industry and collaborators there. So in essence, the definition here is that micro-credentials are short-term learning programs. So the operational term there is really around short-term learning. These are not necessarily extended programs. They do not have, it doesn't take a long period of time to complete. They are shorter and smaller than degrees or even certificates, but they have a timeliness about them that is shorter in nature. They are also comprised of a coherent set of measurable activities, that these can be non-credit bearing activities or projects, and up to 9 credit hours of credit bearing courses. So keep in mind here in this definition, there's a few key terms. First of all is measurable. So when we start to think about micro-credentials, these are not attending a particular workshop just by itself. So attendance does not necessarily make a micro-credential. But what is important is the measurable aspect of the learning. So when we think about our practices around assessment, how learners create evidence of learning and being able to use those to demonstrate their learning, those are the types of things that we're looking at. Now, within this definition, we can have non-credit bearing activities. These might be workshops, these might be seminars, they could be experiential activities even, so they don't necessarily have to be credit-bearing courses. They can be project-based. The other aspect of this is it doesn't have to, but it can include up to 9 hours of credit-bearing courses. So this allows some flexibility both to comprise credit-bearing courses as a part of a micro-credential to make those up, or you can combine non-credit activities and credit-bearing activities within a coherent micro-credential program. So within this definition, there is a good deal of flexibility, but the key component within there is it's measurable. The learning is measurable. There is also some aspects that connect micro-credentialing to careers. So specific career critical skills, competencies, and knowledge. So even courses that are credit bearing, we'd want to begin thinking about what are those competencies that are included within there that have a relatively direct connection to career and workforce learning. And so those sorts of things we start to think can really be transferred to the workplace. So when we look at this definition in a holistic way, we're really looking at building short-term programs that are evidence-based and measurable, that can be comprised of both credit and non-credit activities and elements that have a connection to workplace and benefiting people at a career-based level. So this definition, it provides a framework for us, but there's also a good deal of flexibility that comes within it as well. So when we start to think about the composition of a micro-credential and the structure of a micro-credential, there are a few things to sort of keep in mind. And there are some terms that tend to come into play that we want to be really clear about how they fit into this framework. So the micro-credentialing aspect of it, as we talked about in that definition, is really galvanized around the perspective of competencies. So knowledge, skills, abilities, attitudes. These are the things that people need to know, do, feel, change, that sort of demonstrate their learning process. So you might think about these as in part learning objectives, but it really goes beyond that, is in terms of connecting learning to actual performance and doing. So those are the competencies, and in most cases, competencies are really going to form the foundation of any micro-credential program that gets built. Connected to those competencies are also the evidence of learning. This is where we start to think about assessing how learning happens and the products that learners create or show that learning has occurred. So this might be in the form of some sort of artifact that they build. It might be a demonstration that they perform, or it might be even more conventional assessments that they take, such as an exam or something of that nature. So the assessments are connected to competencies. They should be aligned to one another. The other component here to this triad is really the curriculum. This is the content, the activities, the instruction that are, again, aligned to competencies, but are there to help people learn and to build the knowledge and skills that it takes to demonstrate the assessment of learning. So these three things working together are really the core aspect of a micro-credential. Now, when we think about the other component here, which is a digital badge. So oftentimes, digital badges are used in many different ways. And when we're talking about a micro-credentialing program, a digital badge is a recognition of the completion of competencies. So once someone goes through and they've demonstrated their competency in the micro-credential system, if you will, a digital badge is issued that recognizes their completion and meeting those requirements. And so while a digital badge is often connected and used within micro-credentials, a digital badge in and of itself is not a micro-credential. So it's important to recognize how these components fit together, but also how they are distinct and unique. So really the micro-credentialing is really the complete part of what we're creating here, and that is recognized through the completion of a digital badge. So let's look at some examples of micro-credentials and then, of course, the digital badge that recognizes them. So you can visit upskillok.org, and this is a live website that actually contains a catalog of micro-credentials that have been developed in the state of Oklahoma. And so here we sort of see a listing of a few of those examples. We also have a detailed view of the information around a micro-credential. So you can actually go and select that and see the digital badge and see the data behind the badge that describes the micro-credential program itself. So this can be a really great exercise to go through and explore things that have been done already, and then ways that maybe the ideas that you are creating and working on can really fit in or complement the things that have been developed already. So let's dig a little bit deeper in terms of what is a digital badge, because digital badges are so important to the sharing of micro-credentials, and both sharing what it is, but also sharing the output or the outcomes of micro-credentialing. It's really important to know kind of what they are and what they aren't. So oftentimes when we see or hear about a digital badge, what often comes to mind is the graphical element itself. And while there is a graphic that goes with the digital badge, it sort of makes it visual, if you will, the real power behind them is the data. So each badge is representing a whole host of data that describes that particular micro-credential program, as well as information about the learner and then the earner, in this particular case, the person who has met the criteria for the micro-credential. So each badge has a number of components to it. So it has the name, the issuer, the entity essentially issuing the credential, the recipient, this is the learner who is receiving it, and it has a description. It also has a date at which the badge is issued. So this would be as someone is gone through a micro-credential program, they've met the requirements, and the date that that is issued is what would be appeared on that badge for the learner. It also includes a representation of the competencies or the skills that are included and what learners need to be able to do to earn it. So the criteria and the evidence of learning that shows the learning. There's also an aspect of the attributes that describe the badge. So these might be things like tags or descriptors that go in to be able to describe how that badge fits in the context and the learners that it's intended to serve. So this might be career fields, it might be jobs, anything that would describe how that badge fits in with other things around it. Oftentimes, professional groups have certain standards. These tend to come from associations or professional guilds, if you will. And these standards describe what it is, what it takes to be proficient or a part of that particular profession. And so standards can also be aligned into digital badges to communicate the relationship between someone performing a skill or a competency and aligning to the standards. Now, the other two things that are quite different about digital badges from other types of credentialing is one is expiration date. So with digital badges, it is possible to set an expiration date for the particular activity and the particular work that's going on there. So that's a really key element to consider. The other thing to think about are electronic signatures. So because digital badges are electronic in nature, they can be verified. So if someone is going to a badge that someone has earned, they can actually click on it and verify that indeed it is valid and that it has been issued by who it says it's been issued by. So there's a validation process that this technology also allows for in that case. So let's look at kind of how this system lines out and how it works. So when we start to see how digital badges are used, it often starts with issuers. So issuers are institutions, schools, organizations, really any organization or entity that is issuing or putting that credential out in the market there. So they would create the micro-credential and they would create the classes that go with it, if you will, the curriculum. Once someone has reached the requirements there, they award the badge. And so that badge is awarded to earners or learners in this particular case. And so once the earner receives those, then they can store them in a digital backpack. And so this is where it really hosts the badge, it displays it, and it allows the learner to combine and to assemble the way that badge is presented to the audiences that they want to present to. So once it is there, it's their kind of backpack. It's learner-owned data around their learning journeys and their learning accomplishments. So once it is in that backpack and distributed, it can be verified both from the class standpoint and it can be verified from an employer standpoint. So if someone wanted to see that a particular learner earned a badge on a certain date, they could go and see that record that the learner shared with them and verify that indeed they have met that particular requirement in the learning process. So this system is really working in a holistic way. So as we have issuers who are issuing badges and developing micro-credentialing, we also have learners who are engaging with the content, and we have employers or outside organizations that are really verifying the learning process and journey that, of course, relates to the learners themselves, but also the program that institutions and issuers create in order to demonstrate those. And so it's a very sort of harmonious system that allows multiple pieces to fit together in that way. So as we start to think about activities that will extend your learning and experience with micro-credentials, I want to offer a few ideas for you. So first of all, I'd encourage you to visit the upskillok.org website. And on that, I would encourage you to explore the available micro-credentials that are there. Go look through them, go see the different variety of micro-credentials that have been created, and pay particular attention to how they are developed. So the differences between maybe credit bearing and non-credit bearing, or how they are presented to specific learner groups to meet their needs. And then as you go through and review those, I want to encourage you to think about what you can learn from those examples. So there are certain things you are going to sort of build your own micro-credential around, but you also want to sort of see the examples and ideas that others have built around as well, so that you can learn from and build from those concepts. So once you've done that exploration and looking at the different micro-credentials, I then want to encourage you to select an idea that you have for a micro-credential offering. So this can be the sort of concept that you came to this learning experience to explore, but I want you to sort of select that, and I want you to compare that idea with other available micro-credentials. So it could be something that is very similar. It could be a micro-credential that has certain aspects of it that are similar, but maybe a different concept. And so I essentially want you to compare the general essence of that micro-credential concept that you're interested in exploring with other types of micro-credentials that have already been developed. So that will give you kind of a starter point to begin exploring your project idea and defining that particular idea together. All right, so this lesson has explored what a micro-credential is, Micro-Credentials 101, and it's provided sort of a landscape, a high-level viewpoint of micro-credentials and sort of how they work together, particularly around the issuing of digital badges and the curriculum that goes into comprising the components of a micro-credential.